There is a moment in November when the air shifts subtle at first, like the faint stirring of a curtain in a quiet room. The warmth of autumn recedes, and a thin veil of winter settles across the streets, softening every edge. Tonight, if you listen closely, you might hear the slow exhale of a distant city letting go of its daylight. Street lamps glow with the muted gold of tired lanterns. Windows flicker with the last conversations of the evening, and somewhere, just beyond the hush of your room, history begins to murmur. We begin in Philadelphia, not the loud, sprawling city of films and headlines, but a quieter Philadelphia, the one that breathes beneath the fog. It is dawn, decades ago, the world still wrapped in its own sleepy silence. Cobblestones glisten with the residue of a cold night, and narrow streets wind like dark rivers between rows of brick houses still shivering from the early chill. The sky is pale, barely waking, a watercolor wash of pearl and silver, and into this stillness, footsteps begin. They are slow at first. A shopkeeper lifting the wooden bar from his door, pushing it open with a creak that echoes down an empty alley. A baker wiping flour from her hands as she props her window open to let the scent of warm bread drift toward the morning. A police officer adjusting his hat, pulling his coat tight, inhaling deeply before stepping into the coming storm. Because this is not just any morning, this is the day after Thanksgiving, and on this day, something ancient hums beneath the surface a pool. Toward gathering, preparing, hoping. Families have just finished their feasts. Travelers have taken refuge in spare bedrooms and crowded living rooms, and the pulse of the holiday season begins its slow ascent. But here, in Philadelphia, that pulse beats faster than anywhere else. For reasons no one fully understood at the time, the city woke early, much earlier than anyone expected. A tide of people began to form long before sunrise, families eager to begin their shopping, teenagers wanting to see the famous parade, out-of-towners moving through unfamiliar streets with bright, curious eyes. Every direction, every alley, every corner was soon filled with bodies drifting toward the center of the city like iron filings pulled toward a magnetic point. And the police felt it first, the weight of it, the movement, the gathering storm of footsteps. They had warned the newspapers the day before, almost jokingly, that the city would turn chaotic, that every officer would be needed, that every corner would tremble under the pressure of crowds. They didn't know they were about to name a global tradition. And tonight, as you rest here in the soft quiet, we drift gently toward that moment award, the tired hands that wrote an unexpected phrase in a police ledger, toward the streets that would be swallowed by crowds, toward the myth that would ripple outward into the world. Settle your breathing. Let the room darken around you. Here begins the story of Black Friday born, not from joy or celebration, but from exhaustion, confusion, and the dreamlike wonder of a city waking too fast. As the pale morning opened over Philadelphia, the city's breath seemed to quicken. Fog drifted low across Market Street, blurring the outlines of buildings until they appeared like quiet guardians rising from another era. Lamps glowed along the sidewalks, their amber halos trembling in the cool air, and the sound of distant voices gathered like the soft rustling of leaves before a storm. The crowds moved slowly, at first small clusters of early risers wrapped in wool coats, their hands tucked deep into pockets, breath curling into the air like smoke from dying candles. Mothers held the mittened hands of their children. Older couples walked shoulder to shoulder, leaning into the warmth of one another. Teenagers whispered, laughed, and pointed toward the center of the city, where the parade would soon unfurl its bright, familiar magic. Yet beneath the gentle bustle, a different energy steeped the streets, an undercurrent of anticipation, not chaotic yet, but rising. For in these years, long before the world learned the rhythm of modern holidays, Philadelphia was the heart of a great seasonal migration. Travelers flowed in from nearby towns, villages, and far-flung places across the Northeast. Trains hissed into the station long before dawn, releasing crowds that spilled like warm currents onto the platforms. Buses groaned to a stop, doors folding open to reveal weary passengers clutching small bags. Scarves pulled high against the cold. Even carriages and early automobiles arrived in hesitant streams, engines chugging, horses stamping frost from the cobblestones. And so the tide grew. Police officers posted at corners began to shift uneasily, though no one had yet lost their calm. Their boots thudded softly against the pavement as they walked their routes, tapping gloved hands on the cold metal of their belts, glancing again and again toward the growing masses. They exchanged half smiles, half sighs, and unspoken understanding passing among them that today, like every day after Thanksgiving, would not be a quiet one. Still, they were not prepared. Philadelphia in the mid-20th century held a particular charm. Narrow streets, old brick facades, the tight-knit pattern of a city that had grown upward and outward with determination. Yet this charm also created bottlenecks. Places where the streets narrowed like the neck of an hourglass. Places where the crowds pressed too tightly. Places where noise echoed between stone walls like rolling thunder. As the sun lifted higher, just enough to kiss the tops of buildings with pale gold, the crowd doubled, then tripled, then swelled past anything the morning watchers had imagined. Shop windows rattled with the hum of so many voices. The scent of roasted chestnuts drifted from a street cart, carried by a thin, wandering wind. A trolley bell chimed, then chimed again, then became muffled under the roar of human movement. And somewhere, pressed between the growing waves of bodies, a young police officer new to the force. Uniform stiff and freshly stitched opened the heavy black ledger assigned to his patrol. He pulled a fountain pen from his pocket and began to record the day's first note. His handwriting was steady, looping, practiced, yet the words he wrote were simple. Crowds heavier than anticipated, city strained, Black Friday conditions beginning. No one around him noticed. No one could have known. He closed the ledger. He moved back toward the street. He lifted his hands to direct carriages and early automobiles that sputtered and groaned along the narrowing roads. But the ink had already dried into history. The phrase would linger. Meanwhile, traffic thickened. Philadelphia's streets, never intended for the volume of holiday joy and feverish excitement that descended upon them, began to clog. Cars stalled at corners. Drivers leaned out of windows to glimpse the cause of delay. Trolleys jolted to a stop, their bells ringing in faint desperation before fading again beneath the roar of footsteps. At one intersection, a line of automobiles stretched so far that frustrated drivers simply shut off their engines and stepped outside to talk, their breath forming pale, ghostly clouds. The city was alive for its own comfort. Merchants, arriving to open their shops, found entire crowds waiting like expectant waves beneath their awnings. Some had brought lists. Others carried nothing but hope. The day after Thanksgiving had become, without marketing, without preparation, without foresight, one of the busiest commercial days of the year. Yet no one called it Black Friday out of celebration. The name was born from the exhaustion of those who had to manage it, from the officers overwhelmed, from the shopkeepers buried under demand, from the noise that shook the quiet bones of the city. And as the minutes slipped forward, like pages turning gently in an old book, the weight of the day settled deeper into the streets. Far above it all, On the upper floors of narrow buildings, residents cracked their windows to peer down at the churning river of humanity. Some watched with amusement, others with bewilderment. All of them felt the tremor of something unusual taking root, but none yet understood how far this root would grow. For now, Philadelphia was simply a city overwhelmed, a city brimming with life, a city drowning in its own unexpected abundance, and the story was only beginning. As the pale morning opened over Philadelphia, the city's breath seemed to quicken. Fog drifted low across Market Street, blurring the outlines of buildings until they appeared like quiet guardians rising from another era. Lamps glowed along the sidewalks, their amber halos trembling in the cool air, and the sound of distant voices gathered like the soft rustling of leaves before a storm. The crowds moved slowly, at first small clusters of early risers wrapped in wool coats, their hands tucked deep into pockets, breath curling into the air like smoke from dying candles. Mothers held the mittened hands of their children. Older couples walked shoulder to shoulder, leaning into the warmth of one another. Teenagers whispered, laughed, and pointed toward the center of the city where the parade would soon unfurl its bright, familiar magic. Yet beneath the gentle bustle, a different energy steeped the streets, an undercurrent of anticipation, not chaotic yet, but rising. For in these years, long before the world learned the rhythm of modern holidays, Philadelphia was the heart of a great seasonal migration. Travelers flowed in from nearby towns, villages, and far-flung places across the Northeast. Trains hissed into the station long before dawn, releasing crowds that spilled like warm currents onto the platforms. Buses groaned to a stop, doors folding open to reveal weary passengers clutching small bags, scarves pulled high against the cold. Even carriages and early automobiles arrived in hesitant streams, engines chugging, horses stamping frost from the cobblestones. And so the tide grew. Police officers posted at corners began to shift uneasily, though no one had yet lost their calm. Their boots thudded softly against the pavement as they walked their routes, tapping gloved hands on the cold metal of their belts, glancing again and again toward the growing masses. They exchanged half smiles, half sighs, and unspoken understanding passing among them that today, like every day after Thanksgiving, would not be a quiet one. Still, they were not prepared. Philadelphia in the mid-20th century held a particular charm. Narrow streets, old brick facades, the tight-knit pattern of a city that had grown upward and outward with determination. Yet this charm also created bottlenecks. Places where the streets narrowed like the neck of an hourglass. Places where the crowds pressed too tightly. Places where noise echoed between stone walls like rolling thunder. As the sun lifted higher, just enough to kiss the tops of buildings with pale gold, the crowd doubled, then tripled, then swelled past anything the morning watchers had imagined. Shop windows rattled with the hum of so many voices. The scent of roasted chestnuts drifted from a street cart, carried by a thin, wandering wind. A trolley bell chimed, then chimed again, then became muffled under the roar of human movement. And somewhere, pressed between the growing waves of bodies, a young police officer new to the force. Uniform stiff and freshly stitched, opened the heavy black ledger assigned to his patrol. He pulled a fountain pen from his pocket and began to record the day's first note. His handwriting was steady, looping, practiced, yet the words he wrote were simple. Crowds heavier than anticipated, city strained, Black Friday conditions beginning. No one around him noticed. No one could have known. He closed the ledger. He moved back toward the street. He lifted his hands to direct carriages and early automobiles that sputtered and groaned along the narrowing roads. But the ink had already dried into history. The phrase would linger. Meanwhile, traffic thickened. Philadelphia's streets, never intended for the volume of holiday joy and feverish excitement that descended upon them, began to clog. Cars stalled at corners. Drivers leaned out of windows to glimpse the cause of delay. Trolleys jolted to a stop, their bells ringing in faint desperation before fading again beneath the roar of footsteps. At one intersection, a line of automobiles stretched so far that frustrated drivers simply shut off their engines and stepped outside to talk, their breath forming pale, ghostly clouds. The city was alive for its own comfort. Merchants, arriving to open their shops, found entire crowds waiting like expectant waves beneath their awnings. Some had brought lists. Others carried nothing but hope. The day after Thanksgiving had become, without marketing, without preparation, without foresight, one of the busiest commercial days of the year. Yet no one called it Black Friday out of celebration. The name was born from the exhaustion of those who had to manage it, from the officers overwhelmed, from the shopkeepers buried under demand, from the noise that shook the quiet bones of the city. And as the minutes slipped forward, like pages turning gently in an old book, the weight of the day settled deeper into the streets. Far above it all, on the upper floors of narrow buildings, residents cracked their windows to peer down at the churning river of humanity. Some watched with amusement, others with bewilderment. All of them felt the tremor of something unusual taking root. But none yet understood how far this root would grow. For now, Philadelphia was simply a city overwhelmed, a city brimming with life, a city drowning in its own unexpected abundance. And the story was only beginning. As the hours drifted forward, the light of the day began to soften, sliding from bright noon into the gentler tones of afternoon. Shadows lengthened across the cobblestones, stretching like slow-moving ink between the feet of the crowds. The city, already weary, felt as though it had been awake for far longer than a single day. The sound never truly faded, only changed. The bright laughter of morning had mellowed into a heavier murmur, a low, constant hum like waves against a distant shore. Inside the cramped police station, not far from the busiest streets, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and damp wool. Coats hung from hooks along the wall, still beaded with the moisture of fog and breath. A small coal stove crackled quietly in the corner, struggling to warm the room as officers moved in and out, boots leaving faint trails of November on the wooden floor. Papers rustled, radios hissed, voices overlapped. At a worn desk near the back, Lieutenant Harold Whitmore ran a hand through his graying hair and looked down at the reports piling in. Each note told the same story in slightly different words: overwhelming traffic, suffocating crowds, delays, frayed nerves. His eyes lingered on one particular phrase, repeated again and again in the margins. Black Friday conditions. He exhaled slowly, a tired smile tugging gently at the corner of his mouth, more in resignation than in amusement. Outside the thin windows, he could hear the muffled roar of the city pressing in, like the sea testing the walls of a harbor. Black Friday, he murmured to himself. It does feel that way. He reached for his own pen and, on the daily summary sheet, wrote 3 quiet words at the top of the page. Black Friday report. The ink bled slightly into the paper. Dark and final, beyond the station, in the cramped back rooms of small shops, merchants were fighting their own gentle battles. In a toy store, lit by a single overhead bulb and a string of early holiday lights, the owner, Mr. Levine, stood behind a counter cluttered with wrapping paper and twine. His hands moved quickly, yet his eyes were soft with something like wonder. He had never seen so many people at once. Dolls and wooden trains, tin soldiers and books had flown from the shelves in a constant stream. "It's madness," he whispered to his wife as she tied a ribbon round a small box. "Beautiful, terrible madness." She smiled faintly without pausing her work. "Madness that pays the rent," she replied. But even as they spoke, they felt the strain, the aching feet, the dry throats, the endless requests. It was not a festival carried by music and dancing. It was something denser, heavier, a day that turned the simple act of buying and selling into a tide that pressed on every doorway and every window. As the afternoon leaned slowly toward evening, the parade began to dissolve. Floats were guided away, costumes folded into crates, instruments placed carefully back into their cases. The marching bands, once bright streams of sound, faded into small groups of tired musicians walking home with loosened collars and sleepy eyes. The spectacle was over, but the crowds remained. Now they flowed into the shops with renewed purpose. The city's narrow arteries strained under the shift. Streets that had once held mostly onlookers now held determined shoppers. Hands reached for coats displayed in windows. 4 radios gleaming beneath glass. 4 new fashions promised to keep out the deepening winter cold. Salesmen raised their voices above the noise, calling out offers, though many had not planned anything special for this particular day. The demand had arrived before the strategy. In this unplanned moment, something important slipped silently into place. For years, bookkeepers had spoken of red ink and black ink, of losing and earning, of debt and solvency. But the idea that this day would lift ledgers from loss to profit was not yet a legend. It was simply a quiet hope that the frenzy might make the year's numbers kinder. Only later would storytellers spin a softer tale. That Black Friday was named for the moment when accounts turned from red to black, transforming strain into success. On this original day, the mood was less polished, more raw. Officers leaned against lampposts, rubbing the back of their necks. Drivers sat motionless behind steering wheels, eyes heavy. Children clutched their new treasures and dozed against their parents' sides as they waited for a bus that could barely inch its way through the crowds. Yet as the noise rolled through the streets like thunder softened by distance, there were pockets of deep calm. In a small church, just off one busy avenue, candles flickered in the choir loft, and a single pianist practiced quietly, the notes drifting like warm light through stained glass. Outside, the world pressed and surged. Inside, there was only the gentle rise and fall of melody, a reminder that even on the city's most tangled day, stillness could be found. As the years drifted by, the memory of these early Black Fridays would blur around the edges. People would remember the traffic, the frustration, the exhaustion. They would also remember the strange thrill, the closeness of so many strangers sharing the same narrow streets, the sense that the holiday season had truly begun. But above all, they would remember the name Black Fridays spoken first with a weary sigh, then with a knowing nod, and eventually with the calm certainty of tradition. Philadelphia, without quite intending to, had given the world a new ritual. And far beyond the quiet harbor of that single city, other places were beginning to listen. As the afternoon light mellowed into the soft, amber glow of early evening, a gentle coolness settled once more over Philadelphia. The fog that had lifted earlier began to creep back in thin filaments along the edges of the streets, weaving itself between brick walls and lampposts like a quiet, returning guest. Shop windows flickered with warm yellow light, their reflections trembling on the slick pavement as though stirred by an unseen breeze. The crowds, though still immense, had changed their rhythm. There was less rush now, less frantic shuffling, replaced by a kind of wandering tiredness, a drifting calm that overtook families who had been walking the streets since dawn. Children clutched toys against their chests as sleep tugged at their eyelids. Couples leaned more heavily on one another. Even the chatter of teenagers had softened into a gentle hum, like bees returning slowly to their hive. In the heart of the city, where the traffic jam had become almost immovable, a strange serenity settled over the drivers. Some sat on their hoods, hands wrapped around cups of coffee purchased from street vendors who had wisely followed the crowds. Others shared gentle conversations with strangers leaning from neighboring car windows. A few children played in the narrow spaces between bumpers, watched closely by parents too tired to scold them. The frustration that had gripped the morning had softened into resignation, even companionship. And all the while, the name whispered earlier, Black Friday, hung invisibly above the city, gathering meaning with every passing hour. Near Independence Hall, a photographer named Daniel Morris stood beside his tripod, adjusting the lens of his camera as he watched the scene unfold. His breath fogged the air as he narrowed his eyes, searching for the right angle. He had come intending to capture the elegance of the parade, the whimsy of the floats, the shine of brass instruments under winter sunlight. Instead, he found himself drawn to something far more human, the river of people moving as one great creature through the narrow streets. The lines of stalled automobiles reflecting the fiery hues of dusk, the officers standing solid in their weariness. He pressed the shutter once, then again and again. With each photograph, he preserved a moment that, though ordinary in its chaos, carried the quiet spark of history being formed. Farther west, near a modest bakery that had long sold bread to families of every neighborhood, a small group of workers stepped outside to breathe the cooling air. Their aprons were dusted with flour. Their hands were cracked from hours of kneading. They watched the crowds pass, and one of them, an older man with deep-set eyes, leaned against the doorframe and said, "One day, people will talk about this. They'll say we were here when it began." His co-workers laughed softly, assuming he spoke of the parade or the arrival of the holiday season. But the man meant something else, though he could not have named it. He simply felt, in the marrow of his bones, that the weight of this day carried more than footsteps and purchases and noise. It carried the beginnings of a ritual shaped by countless unnamed souls. In the mid-distance, the bells of a streetcar echoed once, twice, then faded into the thickness of the crowd. The car could not move forward, nor backward. Its conductor rested his elbows on the controls, shaking his head with a smile and surrendering fully to the stillness. Passengers remained inside, some reading newspapers, others gazing out the fogged windows as though watching a slow-moving play unfold. It was in these quieter moments between exhaustion and acceptance that the true significance of the day revealed itself. Black Friday was not simply a name. It was a snapshot of a city overwhelmed by its own enthusiasm, a testament to the pull of tradition, of community, of longing for something bright in the darkening year. And although the city strained under the weight of its own population, it also glittered with a strange, irresistible magic. As dusk deepened, shopkeepers lit candles behind their counters, the flames trembling in the draught as customers continued to trickle in. The scent of cinnamon mingled with the cold air each time the doors opened. On the sidewalks, the warm glow from storefronts cast gentle pools of gold upon the faces passing by, faces flushed with fatigue and happiness in equal measure. From high windows across the city, residents watched the scene below, mesmerized by the weaving lights and restless movement. To them, it looked almost like a festival, though no festival they had known before. It was something raw and unstructured, a vast tide of humanity moving together without clear purpose except to be present, to witness, to participate in the quiet transformation of ordinary tradition into something far greater. And somewhere within that tide, in the pockets of stillness between footsteps, a sense of unity blossomed. Strangers spoke more kindly than usual. Parents shared reminders of patience. Even officers, weary and aching, offered tired smiles as they guided people with gentle gestures. The city breathed heavy, warm, alive. Philadelphia did not yet know it, but this was the first whisper of a tradition that would one day circle the world. A tradition born of crowded streets, cold November mornings, and the simple desire to step into the season with hope. Night was falling. Lanterns were being lit, and the next chapter in this quiet, accidental history was drawing near. As the night finally unfurled its darker cloak over Philadelphia, the city seemed to sigh. The last light of day glimmered faintly on the upper windows of narrow buildings before sinking away entirely, leaving the streets bathed in a softer, more forgiving glow. Street lamps flickered to life one by one, their halos trembling in the cool air like small, patient moons. The fog thickened again, wrapping the corners in a gentle hush, blurring the edges of bricks and glass until everything appeared softened, as if seen through half-closed eyes. The crowds were thinning now, though they did not truly disappear. They stretched out into the evening in quieter, slower strands families, walking home with bags dangling from tired arms, couples carrying small parcels close to their chests, lone travelers heading back toward distant train platforms. The city no longer pulsed with urgency. It drifted instead with a languid, weary rhythm, like waves after a storm has passed. Inside the police station, the coal stove burned lower, its warmth sinking into the bones of the officers who had been on their feet since before dawn. Someone poured another pot of coffee, though few had the energy to drink more than a few sips. The radio still muttered in fits and starts, but the once frantic reports had softened into quieter updates. Streets were still congested, but no longer impassable. Tempers had flared and cooled. The day's worst frictions had dissolved into tired silence. Lieutenant Whitmore sat once more at his desk, the ledger open in front of him. Its pages were crowded with ink, the handwriting growing more hurried and uneven as the hours progressed. Notes about blocked intersections, requests for reinforcements, reports of minor accidents, lost children who had been found, arguments settled, small crises resolved, all the tiny fractures of a city under strain, carefully captured so they would not vanish unremembered. He turned back to the summary page and traced the words he had written there earlier. Black Friday report. For a moment, he simply looked at them, the term resting on the paper like a shadow. To him, it was a practical phrase, a way to name a particular kind of burden, a day unlike the others, when the city demanded more than its usual share of patience and strength. He did not know that outside these walls, the phrase would soon travel further than any of his patrol routes. The night rolled on. At a newspaper office across town, editors and reporters gathered around cluttered desks, the air thick with ink and the rustle of pages. The hum of printing presses below vibrated faintly through the floorboards. A young reporter, his tie loosened and collar unbuttoned, tapped the end of his pencil against his notebook as he searched for the right words to capture the day's events. His notes, like the officers' ledgers, told a story of chaos, endless lines of automobiles, stalled trolleys, crowds spilling into streets never meant for so many feet. He had heard the phrase Black Friday mentioned in passing by a patrolman. The words carried to his ears on a gust of weary laughter. It intrigued him. It held weight and texture, a sense of both darkness and significance. He wrote it once in the margins, then again in the lead sentence of his draft, just to see how it felt. Police describe yesterday's post-Thanksgiving traffic as Black Friday, a day when the city groaned under the weight of holiday crowds. He paused, staring at the line. The phrase seemed to anchor the whole piece, like a stone placed at the center of a pond. Around it, the other details fell into place, the cracked voices of officers calling for backup, the sound of distant horns, the shopkeepers who could barely close their doors against the flow of customers. He did not yet know that with this small choice, he was preparing the name for flight. As the presses began to roll, sheets of paper slipped through inked rollers, emerging marked with words that would be scattered by dawn across the city. Black Friday. Residents would read them over breakfast, over coffee, on their way to work the next day. Some would nod in recognition, others would smile, amused by the severity of the term. But once read, it would be difficult to forget. It would be repeated, shared, and slowly, quietly. It would settle into the language of the season. Outside, in the calmer streets, now slick with reflected lamplight, the remnants of the day drifted home. A mother carrying her sleeping child, a shop clerk walking with shoulders rounded, the soles of his shoes worn thin from standing, an officer heading back to the station with his hat tucked under his arm, hair damp from the fog. Above them all, the city's windows glowed like scattered constellations, each one holding its own small story of the day. The laughter around a dinner table as someone recounted being stuck in traffic for hours. The sigh of a shopkeeper counting the till with aching hands. The quiet of an elderly couple watching the news, hearing the new phrase repeated, wondering whether such a day was worth all the trouble. Yet even in their fatigue, they had felt it, that strange sense of something shared, something bigger than any one person. Black Friday was not born in fireworks or fanfare. It arrived like the fog rolling in from the river, quietly, steadily, threading itself through conversations and records, through headlines and memories. It grew in the spaces between complaint and admiration, between exhaustion and pride, until it no longer belonged only to the police or the merchants or the residents of Philadelphia. It belonged to the season itself. And as the city finally settled into its late-night rhythm, with trolleys resting, storefronts darkened, and only the soft glow of a few all-night diners marking the corners of the quiet streets, the name slept lightly over the rooftops, waiting for the years to carry it farther, far beyond this city, far beyond this decade, into the wide, listening world. By the time Philadelphia drifted past midnight, the city felt suspended, held gently between the echo of the day that had passed and the anticipation of the dawn yet to come. The streets had grown quiet, their earlier chaos replaced with the soft crackle of lamps and the distant hum of occasional footsteps. Fog pooled in low banks beside curbs, drifting lazily across intersections, now free of the press of automobiles. The city, exhausted yet peaceful, rested like a great creature finally lulled to sleep. In the calm of those late hours, the storefronts stood dark except for a few lingering glimmers of golden light where merchants were still closing their accounts for the day. Inside a small shop selling fine coats and woolen scarves, Mr. Calloway sat hunched at his desk with a candle flickering near his ledger. His hands moved slowly as he recorded the day's earnings, each number written with care despite the ache in his fingers. He paused, leaned back, and listened. Outside, the world was so quiet he could hear the faint vibration of a distant streetcar settling onto its overnight rails. He thought of the crowds that had pushed through his doors that morning, the choir of voices rising and falling with each new hour. the steady pulse of footsteps that had resonated through the wooden floorboards like a living heartbeat. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "What a day," he whispered. In another part of the city, on the top floor of a narrow row house overlooking Market Street, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carmichael pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she sat beside her bedroom window. Her apartment was dim, lit only by a small lamp with a lace shade, its pattern casting delicate shadows upon the wall. She had spent most of the day indoors, observing the world through her window as if watching the turning pages of a storybook. She had seen the children darting through the crowds, the long lines of cars stretching endlessly into the distance, the officers waving their arms in practiced arcs. She had seen the joy, the strain, the color, the friction, and yet she felt no frustration. To her, these things belonged to the living pulse of the city she loved. Philadelphia breathed loudly sometimes, she often said. It reminded her that she was alive, too. Now, as she gazed down at the empty street, she murmured, "The calm after the storm." Then, after a moment, she added, "And tomorrow they will speak of this day. They always do." She was right. By the next morning, the newspapers scattered across breakfast tables would carry the term Black Friday in bold letters. Some readers would chuckle, amused by the dramatic name. Others would nod knowingly. But none of them could have predicted that the phrase would not remain trapped in the borders of Philadelphia's bustling holiday season. It would travel, and as it traveled, it would transform. Yet tonight, the city slept under its gentle fog, unaware of the future it had just set in motion. Far beyond the heart of the city, near the river where the water whispered against the docks, a lone fisherman packed his gear into a wooden crate. He had watched the distant glow of the city all day, seen the haze rise and fade, heard rumors from travelers stopping briefly on their journeys. He shook his head as he secured a rope around his boat. "All this over a parade," he said softly, though he knew it was more than that. Something deeper hummed through the streets, an unspoken longing, a yearning that surfaced each year as the world edged toward winter. The crowds did not gather only to shop. They gathered to feel the season begin, to step into a moment that felt larger than themselves. And that moment, by sheer force of repetition and memory, was now shaped into a name. Back in the city center, a few officers still patrolled with slow steps, their breath clouds drifting into the night. They nodded to the lingering shopkeepers, exchanged quiet greetings with those heading home late. There was no tension now, only the warmth of shared experience lingering like embers glowing softly in the dark. Young Officer Harris, the patrolman who had first written the words Black Friday conditions, walked the final stretch of his route with heavy boots but a light heart. He stopped at a bench beneath a lamppost, sat down, and removed his hat. The glow above him bathed his face in gold, softening the fatigue etched around his eyes. He thought of the moment he had written the phrase in the ledger, unaware that it would ripple outward into the world. To him, it had simply been a description, practical, immediate, unadorned. But now, reflecting on the day's weight, he realized the words carried something more. They captured a feeling, a truth of the moment, a piece of the living city. "Black Friday," he whispered into the quiet. I suppose that's what it was. The city's clock tower chimed once, marking the hour. Its deep resonance rolled through the fog, settling into the stones, the windows, the empty streets. The sound seemed to tuck the city in, like a final note in a long, weary lullaby. Philadelphia had survived another post-Thanksgiving storm not of weather, but of humanity. And with that storm, it had unknowingly given the world a name it would carry into countless Novembers to come. Tonight, though, the streets belonged to silence. Tonight, the fog reclaimed its gentle dominion. Tonight, Black Friday was only a whisper. The world would listen soon enough. As the years drifted by, the memory of that first named Black Friday did not vanish. It settled instead into the quiet folds of Philadelphia's seasonal rhythm, returning each year like a familiar, if somewhat unruly, visitor. The pattern repeated itself. Thanksgiving would pass in a gentle blur of warm kitchens and crowded tables, and then, as if on cue, the city would awaken to a day of dense crowds, choked streets, and weary officers repeating the same tired jokes. Black Friday, they still called it. The words were passed from shift to shift, from veteran officers to younger recruits, from one margin of a ledger to another. It was not a celebration so much as a warning, shorthand, for what to expect when the last plates of turkey had been cleared, and the first hints of winter brushed against the windows. Outside the police force, the phrase began to drift further, like smoke seeping under a door. Reporters heard it again and again, murmured with a half-sigh in conversations near street corners and station houses. Each November, their stories returned to the same theme: traffic, crowds, and the curious intensity of the day after Thanksgiving in Philadelphia. Articles described streets transformed into rivers of humanity, sidewalks overflowing, officers forced to work longer hours to keep the city from locking itself into a grid of unmoving metal. And every so often, in these stories, the term appeared again. Once more, the city braced for Black Friday. The more it was printed, the more firmly it rooted itself in the city's imagination. People began to use it casually in conversation. Will you be working on Black Friday? Be sure to leave early. You know what Black Friday is like. I'll stay home next Black Friday, if I can help it. In the shops, the day was still seen mostly as an ordeal. Merchants appreciated the sales, of course, but they dreaded the strain. Shelves were emptied faster than they could be replenished. Floors needed constant sweeping. Voices grew hoarse from answering the same questions 100 times. And when the doors finally locked at night, when the last customer's footsteps faded away, owners would sit heavily behind their counters and feel an enormous, echoing silence. Yet even in that exhaustion, an idea was forming. Far beyond the windows where snow sometimes began to fall in delicate flakes, the language of business was changing. Advertisers, ever watchful, leaned closer to this noisy, troublesome day and began to wonder if there was something more to be made from it. What if the chaos could be shaped? What if the strain could become spectacle? What if Black Friday, instead of a burden, could become a beacon? The transformation did not happen all at once. It moved slowly, gently, like the tide creeping higher along a shoreline. First came the small notices in newspapers, sales mentioned in narrow columns, quiet invitations for shoppers to return after Thanksgiving. Then came the posters in windows, promising modest discounts, special offerings, or limited time items to those brave enough to face the crowds. Year by year, the decorations grew brighter, the fonts larger, the promises more direct. And still, the name remained a dark frame around the golden glow of opportunity. Not everyone liked it. Among merchants' associations, the term Black Friday was viewed with discomfort. It seemed heavy, ominous, unfriendly. Some proposed alternatives, brighter phrases meant to soften the sharpness of the name. Big Friday, they suggested, or other hopeful titles, meant to catch the ear without conjuring the fatigue of police officers and the snarled breath of traffic. But names are like stones that have already been thrown into water. Once they have struck the surface, once the ripples have spread, they are difficult to catch and rename. The public had taken hold of Black Friday, and it remained stubborn and familiar. Over time, other stories gathered around it, like leaves collecting at the base of a tree. People began to say, with a knowing nod, that Black Friday referred not to the heaviness of the day, but to the moment when merchants' books turned from red to black, from loss to profit, from scarcity to abundance. It was a softer tale, more comforting, easier to repeat without remembering the sweat on officers' brows or the endless line of idling cars. In warm living rooms, lit by table lamps and the soft glow of televisions, families passed these stories between them. One person would speak of traffic and crowds. Another would speak of ledgers and ink. Between these versions, the day took on a dual nature, both trial and triumph, both strain and salvation. And through it all, the sensory world of Black Friday remained the same. The early morning chill nipping at fingertips as shoppers queued outside still dark doors, the sound of boots on wet pavement, the glow of store lights piercing the dawn like beacons, the murmur of voices rising and falling like the ocean, the smells of coffee, baked bread, and wool coats warmed by crowded interiors, the quiet exhaustion at day's end when the city finally surrendered to the pull of night. As the decades moved forward, Philadelphia would no longer hold this tradition alone. Other cities would begin to notice the power of the day after Thanksgiving, would borrow the term Black Friday, and would slowly reshape their own streets to meet its demands. But in the gentle, hazy origins, it remained a local story, one city's attempt to name the strange, beautiful burden of its own abundance. Far beyond the quiet harbor of those first years, the world was watching without quite realizing it. The pattern was being set. The ritual was unfolding, and in the soft spaces between headlines and ledgers, a question began to whisper. What happens when a single city storm becomes everyone's season? As the name Black Friday continued its slow journey outward, carried by whispers, stories, and headlines, the world beyond Philadelphia began to sense a change in the cultural wind. The mid-20th century in America was a time of shifting rhythms, cities expanding like ripples in a pond, families settling into new routines shaped by prosperity and uncertainty, and the holiday season itself blossoming into something more elaborate, more anticipated, more dazzling than ever before. Beyond the old brick canyons of Philadelphia, other cities watched the day after Thanksgiving with cautious curiosity. Some saw only the chaos, the crowds pressing into stores, the clogged intersections, the staggering pressure placed on police and workers. Others saw something different, kind of electric potential, glowing just beneath the surface, waiting to be shaped by human hands and hopeful minds. In New York, department store executives sent scouts to observe Philadelphia's strange tradition. These men walked the crowded streets with notebooks tucked beneath their arms, jotting down observations as their polished shoes slipped slightly on damp pavement. They wrote of the density of shoppers, the long lines outside toy stores, the excitement that hummed even in frustration. Though they did not yet name it, they recognized the possibility of a new kind of holiday harvest. In Chicago, merchants gathered in dim conference rooms above their shops, sipping weak coffee as they pored over reports sent by colleagues in the East. They spoke in low tones about the day's predictable traffic jams, the surge in foot traffic, and the peculiar magnetism that seemed to draw people out of their homes despite the cold. Someone mentioned the name Black Friday, though the phrase was still unfamiliar to most ears. The merchants frowned at its heaviness, yet they could not deny the clarity it provided. And in smaller towns, where the rhythms of life were gentler, residents read articles about Philadelphia's annual ordeal and shook their heads with a smile. They clucked their tongues at the thought of crowds so large that even trolleys could not move. They imagined the city wrapped in fog and footfall, bustling with energy on a day when most places preferred to rest. For them, the day after Thanksgiving was still slow, marked by leftover meals, quiet games, and walks down empty streets. Yet even in those calm places, curiosity flickered. The idea that a single day could carry such weight, could draw such crowds, could transform a city into a living current of tradition, it captured the imagination. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia itself, the pattern deepened. Every year, the streets felt a bit more crowded. The lines outside storefronts stretched a bit farther. By midday, the city thrummed with the same rhythmic pulse, a steady throb of voices, motion, and anticipation. Officers learned to pace themselves, merchants learned to prepare, and families learned to arrive early if they wished to see the parade. It became part of the city's story, woven into the fabric of November like a thread of dark silk. Yet with each passing year, one more thing happened. The language of commerce grew louder. Advertisers, sensing a shifting tide, began to use the term Black Friday not as a caution, but as an invitation. They spoke of early discounts, extended hours, and special deals framed in warm, enticing tones meant to pull shoppers deeper into the season. The darker edges of the name began to soften, wrapped in the golden glow of holiday opportunity. For the first time, the day began not with dread, but with promise. In the offices of large retailers, executives gathered around wide wooden tables, sliding crisp sheets of paper across polished surfaces as they discussed strategy. In those smoke-filled rooms, lit by brass lamps and clouded by voices, a new idea took root. If the crowds would come regardless, why not give them a reason to come earlier, faster, in greater numbers? Thus began the gentle mingling of chaos and choreography. Stores opened slightly before their usual time. Signs promising limited quantities appeared in windows. Newspaper ads arrived a week early, bold letters calling to families who had never before thought of shopping as a post-Thanksgiving ritual. And yet, Philadelphia's original essence remained intact. In the fog-kissed mornings, people still gathered for reasons beyond sales. It was the unofficial start of winter festivities, a chance to step into the season's light. Even as deals grew larger, crowds came as much for the feeling as for the bargains. They sought the warmth of shared purpose, the joy of tradition, the comforting notion that each year, at the same moment, the city would breathe in unison. Black Friday had begun to stretch its wings, but the most extraordinary shift was still ahead. Late one evening, years after the term first inked itself into a weary ledger, a young woman stood on the elevated platform of a train station, preparing to travel home to her parents' small town. She clutched a newspaper in her hands, the headline mentioning Black Friday in bold letters. As she waited, a man beside her nodded at the phrase. "Always like that in Philadelphia," he said. She smiled, replying, "I wonder if it will spread." They both fell quiet, gazing down at the tracks, curling into the distance like a silver ribbon, unaware that the question she had asked would soon unfold in ways neither could imagine. For every tradition begins small. Every ritual begins in a single place, with a single crowd, a single name whispered into the evening air. And then, slowly, softly, it begins to move. Black Friday was no longer just Philadelphia's burden. It was becoming America's, one city at a time. As the decades unfolded like slow-turning pages, the story of Black Friday stepped quietly beyond the boundaries of Philadelphia and began to wander through other cities, other skies, other November mornings, The fog that once wrapped itself around narrow brick streets now seemed to drift along highways and over new suburbs, following the slow migration of families who had traded row houses for small lawns and wide driveways. The landscape was changing, but the pulse beneath it remained the same, a longing for warmth, for ritual, for a shared beginning to the closing chapter of the year. Across America, the map of holiday life was redrawn. New shopping districts rose where fields had once stretched in quiet simplicity. Department stores, with their shining glass facades and polished floors, anchored vast parking lots that glittered with chrome beneath winter light. Enclosed malls appeared like modern cathedrals of commerce, their ceilings high and echoing, their interiors forever set to an artificial twilight of soft lamps and careful decoration. Inside, the air carried the mingled scents of perfume, coffee, new fabric, and warm pretzels. Into this new world, Black Friday arrived on gentle feet. At first, it was a faint echo, a headline here, a mention there. Merchants in distant cities had heard the stories of Philadelphia's crowded streets and exhausted officers and sensed in them both a warning and an invitation. Slowly, they began to shape their own versions of the day after Thanksgiving, adapting it to the wide roads and broad storefronts of their growing towns. Doors opened earlier. Sales were advertised more boldly. Windows were dressed with signs promising one day only, the words glowing softly behind glass-like secret constellations. Soon, in the dim hours before dawn, parking lots that were usually empty and silent now held scattered islands of light where cars were already pulling in. Engines idled as families sat inside, wrapped in coats, their breath clouding the windows. Radios murmured quietly, the soft hum of music underlining their drowsy anticipation. Children dozed in the back seats, while parents sipped coffee from paper cups, watching as more vehicles arrived, their headlights cutting thin paths through the darkness. Inside one such car, in a small Midwestern town, a woman named Evelyn sat with her teenage son and daughter, the heater ticking gently as it worked against the cold. She had grown up hearing the words Black Friday spoken like a distant legend, something that happened in big eastern cities, full of crowds and clamor. Yet here she was now, waiting beneath the glow of a department store sign, its letters casting long reflections on the hood of their car. Her son yawned and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. "Do you think it will really be crowded?" he asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Perhaps," she replied. "But we are not only here for the bargains, are we?" Her daughter, clutching a small handwritten list, shook her head. "It feels like the start," she said softly. "As if today we turn a key and the rest of the season opens." As the clock crept closer to the hour, others emerged from their cars, footsteps echoing softly on the asphalt. The automatic doors of the store remained closed for a while longer, their glass reflecting clusters of expectant faces. A thin layer of mist clung to the edges of the lot, and the sky above blushed with the first hints of approaching dawn. When the doors finally slid open with a quiet hiss, people moved forward not with the wild rush of a storm, but with the slow, patient current of a river. They stepped into warmth and music and light. Holiday displays shimmered from every corner. Garlands draped along railings, ornaments catching the soft glow of chandeliers. Mannequins wrapped in winter coats that looked almost like armor against the season's chill. Elsewhere, in larger cities, the scene was louder, brighter, more intense. But beneath every variation, there was a shared feeling, a sense of crossing a threshold together. Black Friday had become a national ritual. Newspapers across the country now wrote of it with easy familiarity. Broadcasters spoke the words into living rooms, where families sat together beneath knitted blankets, the flicker of the television screen painting their faces with pale light. The holiday shopping season officially begins, they would say, and images of crowded stores and bustling streets would follow, framed not as burden but as spectacle. Yet, if one listened carefully to the spaces between the words, the deeper layers remained. Behind each image of crowded aisles, there were individuals, a store clerk waking before dawn, washing his face in cold water as he prepared for a 12-hour shift, a janitor pausing in a quiet corner to stretch aching shoulders before the doors opened, a grandmother choosing a single, carefully considered gift for a grandchild she rarely saw. In their ordinary acts, they carried the same mixture of hope, fatigue, and tenderness that had once filled Philadelphia's foggy streets. And still, the old stories traveled alongside the new. People spoke of the origin of the name in different ways. Some remembered police officers and traffic jams. Others repeated the softer myth of red ink turning to black as merchants finally stepped into profit. The truth lay somewhere between them, resting gently in the hands of history, neither fully light nor fully dark. Like so many human traditions, Black Friday held both shadow and glow, strain and celebration. As the day rooted itself deeper into the American calendar, its sound changed, but its rhythm did not. There were still footsteps on cold pavement. There were still lights piercing the early morning fog. There were still voices, distant, layered, overlapping like waves upon waves. And above it all, November's sky watched silently, its pale sun rising slowly over highways and shopping centers, over quiet homes and crowded streets, over people who, whether they loved or disliked the tradition, found themselves living inside it, far beyond the places where it began. Black Friday had become something the entire country now recognized, a signal, a threshold, a shared turning of the year. And just beyond the horizon of this new ritual, another transformation waited the moment when lines and doors and roads would begin to dissolve into something more invisible, more quiet, and yet in its own way, no less powerful. But for now, in these years of parking lots and department stores, the story still walked on 2 feet, still echoed in the sound of opening doors, still glowed in the lamplight of early morning. The world had taken Philadelphia's whisper and turned it into a chorus, and the night, listening carefully, prepared to carry that chorus into the age of screens and silent signals. As the 20th century edged toward its final decades, the world around Black Friday continued to change. Cities grew taller, their skylines rising like steel forests illuminated by thousands of glowing windows. Suburbs stretched outward in gentle waves, tracing new patterns across the land. Highways widened and lengthened, curving like pale ribbons across the countryside, carrying people farther and faster than ever before. And with every change came new rituals, new expectations, and a deepening transformation of the holiday season. By now, the day after Thanksgiving was firmly rooted in American life. It had grown beyond Philadelphia's fog-bound streets and become a familiar landmark in the national calendar, a day that whispered the arrival of winter festivities, a day when families rose early or chose to sleep in, depending on their traditions. Some rushed into the early crowds, others avoided them entirely, but everyone knew the name, Black Friday. Yet even as the ritual spread, the world around it was shifting. Technology was weaving itself into daily life, first slowly, almost imperceptibly, then with increasing boldness. Screens began to glow in living rooms long after the sun had set. Televisions flickered with ads promising special deals. Radios, once filled with music and news, now carried jingles that reminded listeners of the approaching holiday rush. The quiet corners of American households were filling with new forms of light, new voices guiding the rhythms of the season. For many families, Black Friday became less an ordeal and more an event shared between generations. In a small living room in Ohio, a father and his young son sat on the carpet late one evening, surrounded by newspaper circulars spread out like colorful leaves. The boy traced the pictures of toys with wide eyes, circling a few with a red crayon. His father pointed out items they might look for in the morning, his voice gentle and unhurried. They were planning, yes, but they were also weaving memory, quiet, warm, tender moments held between the flickering fireplace and the promise of the next day. Far away, in a bustling California suburb, sisters gathered at the kitchen table beneath a dim pendant lamp, sipping hot chocolate as they mapped out the stores they hoped to visit. Their laughter rose softly into the night, each giggle a bright spark against the dark windows. They spoke of sweaters, books, and small treasures they wished to find, but more than that, they spoke of the joy of going together, just as they had the year before, and the year before that. Black Friday had become, in many places, a tradition of togetherness. But as the years pressed forward, whispers of change danced along the edges of the day. Some people began to question the intensity of the crowds, the early mornings, the frantic energy that seemed woven through the heart of the ritual. Others embraced it even more passionately, treating the day as a kind of pilgrimage into the brightly lit corridors of malls and department stores. In one corner of a busy shopping center in Texas, a janitor named Reuben paused beside a small bench as the crowds surged past. He leaned on his broom and watched as shoppers hurried along, their faces lit by the cool glow of overhead lights. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, pointing at displays. Friends called to one another across aisles. Salespeople moved with practiced smiles and careful, steady steps. Reuben shook his head and smiled softly. Every year, the same music, the same steps, he murmured to himself. But he did not say it with weariness. There was affection in his voice, too understanding that he was watching a kind of seasonal dance unfold, one that returned again and again with familiar grace. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the Midwest, a teacher named Lillian woke early on Black Friday not to shop, but to simply sit by her window with a cup of tea. She watched as her neighbors backed their cars out of driveways, bundled in coats, hurrying toward distant stores. She did not join them, yet she felt a connection to the ritual all the same. For her, Black Friday was a marker, a gentle signal that the year was drawing to a close, that winter was settling in, that the world would soon turn inward toward warmth, celebration, and rest. People gather in different ways, she whispered to the stillness, but they gather all the same. In this way, the meaning of the day stretched and shifted depending on where one stood, like light passing through mist. It could be frenzy or companionship, burden or joy, inconvenience or ritual. And it was precisely this duality that allowed Black Friday to root itself so deeply into the cultural calendar. It was flexible, it adapted, it grew. And yet, even as these patterns deepened, another transformation was waiting quietly in the wings, something smaller, faster, more invisible than the crowds that filled parking lots and stores. It began not in the streets, but in the soft glow of screens. Computers, once rare curiosities found only in offices, began to enter homes. Their faint hum blended with the sounds of family life. Modems chirped and buzzed as they connected to distant servers. Information traveled through invisible channels, carrying with it the first whispers of a new age, an age in which footsteps and doorways would give way to keystrokes and pixels, An age in which Black Friday would no longer belong solely to streets and storefronts, but would find a new, softer path through the veins of the digital world. But that chapter had not yet fully begun. For now, the nation still moved on foot, through fog and light and the warm breath of crowded malls, and the quiet origins of Black Friday, born in exhaustion, shaped by chance, carried by tradition, continued to blossom into a ritual that bound millions together beneath the soft glow of November skies. It began, as so many quiet revolutions do, with a different kind of light. Not the golden glow of shop windows in the early morning, nor the pale beams of car headlights slicing through fog, but the cool, steady shimmer of screens. In darkened rooms across the world, small rectangles of light floated above keyboards and laps, casting gentle reflections on glasses, tabletops, and the corners of framed photographs. Outside, the night settled as it always had, soft, deep, and patient. Inside, a new kind of lantern burned. At first, this light did not seem to belong to Black Friday at all. It was the province of letters and early messages, of pixelated images and small experiments. People used it to send words across great distances, to look up facts, to read the news without unfolding any paper. The hum of modems, like distant insects in tall grass, was the soundtrack of this age's first hesitant steps. Yet the logic of the world is like water. It seeks paths, finds connections, slips quietly into every available space. Soon, the calm glow of these screens began to mingle with the rhythms of the holiday season. In one modest apartment overlooking a city street that had once been thick with cars on Black Friday mornings, a young woman named Clara sat at her desk, the only light in her room coming from the monitor before her. Outside, the pavement was wet from a recent rain, catching faint reflections from a few scattered street lamps. Long ago, the sidewalks below had been crowded with shoppers carrying heavy bags. Now, as the clock neared midnight, they were almost empty. Yet Clara was not alone. On her screen, a message blinked softly. Black Friday deals begin at 12 a.m. She wrapped her hands around a mug of tea, the steam rising like a ghost in the dimness, and smiled faintly. Instead of planning routes through crowded streets, she opened tabs in her browser. Each one became a doorway to a different storno. Sidewalks required, no car to warm up against the cold. With a few slow clicks, she wandered through digital aisles, her footsteps replaced by the subtle tap of keys. In another place, far away, a man in a quiet village did the same, and in another, and another. Across continents and oceans, people sat in rooms lit only by their screens, listening to the soft sounds of their homes, the creak of radiators, the sigh of wind against window panes, the distant hush of passing cars, and allowed themselves to be drawn slowly into this new way of entering the season. Black Friday, once tied so tightly to traffic jams and store entrances, had slipped into the silent highways of the internet. The change was gradual, like the turning of a river over many years. At first, the digital version of the day seemed like a gentle echo of the physical one, small accompaniment rather than a replacement. But with every passing season, the echo grew louder. Online offers began not only on the day after Thanksgiving, but at midnight or even earlier. Advertisements glowed from banners and inboxes instead of posters and windows. The rhythm shifted. The sensory experience changed as well. Instead of feeling the bite of cold air while standing in pre-dawn lines, people felt the warmth of blankets pulled over their legs as they browsed from bed. Instead of hearing the mingled voices of a crowd, they heard the soft tapping of their own fingers. Perhaps the ticking of a clock on the wall, the quiet murmur of a late-night radio. The scent of wet wool and hot coffee in public spaces was replaced by the smell of familiar room-laundered sheets, candle wax, a kettle on the stove. Yet beneath this new quiet, something old remained. The impulse was the same, to step across a threshold together, to mark the beginning of the holiday season with a shared act, even if it was now performed in solitude, scattered across countless homes. The ritual had become invisible from the outside, but no less real. The crowd was no longer a river of bodies in a single city, but a constellation of solitary figures, each lit by a private screen, all connected by the same quiet anticipation. In some places, the traditional Black Friday persisted. Unchanged lines still formed outside certain doors. Footsteps still echoed on parking lots, still slick with early frost. In others, the day softened, its fever eased by the knowledge that the same offers might be found at home without the press of strangers. Slowly, another name sidled into the lexicon: Cyber Monday, yet even that remained tied by a silver thread to the original storm in Philadelphia. The shopping season, once concentrated in a single overwhelming day, began to stretch and soften, like a knot slowly loosening under warm hands. Sales lasted longer. Discounts crept forward into the days and weeks before and after. The sharp edge of the word black in Black Friday grew duller, less ominous, worn smooth by repetition and reinvention. But the story was still there, if one listened. It could be heard between the lines of promotional emails, in the tired but fond tone of workers who spoke of their long shifts, in the quiet nostalgia of older generations who remembered standing outside in the cold, watching the fog slowly lift from crowded streets. Black Friday had become many things at once: a memory of a city's struggle, a symbol of economic hope, a shared ritual, a subject of debate, a quiet midnight habit. It was no longer a single experience, but a tapestry of experiences, layered one upon another like thin sheets of gold pressed over old stone. And as the digital age deepened, the world's relationship to this day continued to evolve. Yet beneath the flicker of pixels and the hush of turning years, Philadelphia's fog still lingered, somewhere in the background of history, soft, persistent, and full of echoes. The memory of that first weary ledger, that first cramped traffic jam, that first whispered phrase, remained like a lantern glowing dimly at the beginning of a long, winding path. For even when we forget the origins of our rituals, they continue to hold us, gently, in their unseen hands. As the 21st century unfolded, a new rhythm settled into the bones of the world. The glow of digital screens grew brighter, more constant. Phones, once tucked away in corners or pockets, now rested on bedside tables like tiny modern lanterns, illuminating the darkness with soft, blue-white light. Tablets flickered in living rooms, laptops hummed on kitchen counters, and Black Friday, once a creature of fog, footsteps, and breath steaming in the early morning cold, found itself expanding quietly into this new terrain. It did not lose its roots entirely. In many places, the old scenes continued with familiar warmth. People waking before dawn to greet the biting chill. Cars gathering in the pale glow of streetlights, the soft blur of breath against frosted windows. But alongside these traditions, another world grew, as if layered in translucent sheets over the one that came before. This new world had no traffic jams, no fog, no crowded sidewalks. It had silence, deep, steady, comforting silence. On a quiet street in Oregon, a young couple woke just before sunrise. Their home was filled with the smell of pine from a small tree they had brought home the night before. Instead of bundling up to face the cold, they stayed wrapped in blankets as they sat side by side on the couch, their feet brushing beneath the fabric. The only light in the room came from the fireplace and the soft glow of the laptop perched on the coffee table. They moved slowly, peacefully, sipping warm apple cider as they scrolled through pages of online shops. "Strange how calm it is now," the woman murmured, resting her head on her partner's shoulder. He smiled, watching the quiet snowfall outside. Maybe that's how it should have always been. But even in this stillness, the heartbeat of Black Friday persisted. The old intention of stepping into the season together lived beneath every click, every quiet decision, every whispered wish list. Thousands of miles away, in a high-rise apartment in Seoul, a man sat at his desk long after most of the city had gone to sleep. The screen's cool glow illuminated his face and the steam rising slowly from his cup of barley tea. Below him, the streets were nearly empty, traffic lights changing in perfect, lonely sequences. He scrolled through international retailers offering Black Friday deals, a tradition he had never witnessed in person, yet one he now experienced intimately through the soft hum of his computer. "It's strange," he whispered to the empty room, "that a day so chaotic could become something so quiet." Meanwhile, in a small town in the south of France, a single boutique owner named Colette turned her window sign to Outlived and prepared for what had become, surprisingly, one of her busiest days of the season. For years, Black Friday had belonged solely to American culture, distant storm across an ocean. But in time, it had drifted outward, carried on the currents of commerce and curiosity. Now, even in small European towns, the day left faint ripples, subtle enough to be optional, but present enough to be felt. Colette moved through her shop with deliberate, graceful motions, arranging scarves and candles, straightening displays, humming softly to herself. A few customers entered the store soon after, smiling shyly as they remarked on the American tradition they had come to observe. The day felt different, here gentler, lighter, less hurried. Yet Colette sensed the invisible thread connecting her tiny shop to the larger world, woven through years of history she'd only recently discovered. She pictured the fog-filled streets of Philadelphia described in an article she once read, imagining the breath of crowds rising like mist. She imagined tired officers leaning against lampposts, shopkeepers wiping their brows, parents holding children close amid the press of bodies, and she laughed softly to herself, shaking her head. All this, she whispered, from a traffic jam, across the world. Black Friday had become something fluid, shaped by culture, by distance, by time. In some places, it was loud and exuberant. In others, quiet and contemplative. What had once been a single city's challenge had transformed into a global mosaic of traditions, each colored by the lives that lived within it. But even as the day spread far from its origins, the essence of ether, true heartbeats, still echoed with the faint rhythms of that long-ago morning. The fog, the footsteps, the ledger, the unknowing birth of a name. Every year, without fail, newspapers and broadcasters would revisit the story, telling it again in soft, simplified strokes. Some versions leaned toward the myth of red and black ink. Others dwelled on the police officers who had coined the term in weary resignation. A few chose to describe the deeper truth that Black Friday had not truly been born in a single moment, but in a collection of moments, layered gently over one another like sheets of tracing paper. And behind these stories, the world continued to evolve. One evening, a family sat around their dining table in Buenos Aires, their dinner plates still fragrant with the warmth of a shared meal. The daughter, studying history at university, explained to her parents that Black Friday had not always been about shopping at all, that it had once been a local phenomenon. a name used reluctantly, almost humorously, by the police. Her father raised his eyebrows in surprise. "So this day we follow," he said, "comes from that, from crowds." The daughter nodded with a small smile, resting her chin in her hand. "From crowds," she whispered, "and from the way cities breathe when we gather together. Throughout the world, the meaning of Black Friday shifted in small, subtle ways, yet in every version of the day, something remained constant: the desire to step into the winter season with purpose, with hope, with the quiet anticipation of what lies ahead. Black Friday had become a river with countless branches, some swift, some gentle, some nearly still, but every branch traced back to the same source: a single city, waking too early, carrying more people than its streets could hold, and whispering a name into the fog, a name now carried by millions. As the story of Black Friday flowed across borders and languages, it became less of a single tale and more of a mirror. In each place it arrived, it reflected something of the people who received it: their hopes, their fears, their habits, their ways of gathering and letting go. Some saw in it opportunity, others saw excess. Many saw both at once, like light and shadow cast by the same flickering candle. Yet beneath all these meanings, the day held a quieter truth. It was, at its heart, a story of how human beings respond to the turning of the year. When the days grow shorter and the nights stretch longer, something within us stirs. We sense the approach of winter, not only in the air that grows colder, but in the subtle hush that descends over trees, fields, and sidewalks. We look for warmth, physical, emotional, spiritual. We seek light in many forms: in lamps, in candles, in screens, in the kindness of others. And we mark this turning with rituals of our own making, some ancient and some astonishingly new. In this way, Black Friday is not so different from the festivals and market days that once filled medieval town squares, or the great fairs that drew caravans from distant lands. Across centuries, people have gathered when the year leaned toward its darkest days, seeking connection, comfort, and small treasures to carry them through the cold. One winter evening, in a quiet village in the north of England, an elderly man named Thomas sat near his fireplace, the flames reflecting softly in his eyes as his granddaughter asked him about Black Friday. She had seen images, online crowds, advertisements, long lines, and she wanted to know what he thought of it all. Thomas took a slow breath, listening to the gentle hiss and crackle of the logs. Outside, wind brushed against the windows like a distant hand. He thought of his own childhood, of market days in the town square where stalls were lit by lanterns and people came to buy simple goods, to talk, to share news, to feel less alone in the long stretch of winter ahead. At its worst, he said quietly, it can look like greed. At its best, perhaps, it's just another way we try to feel that we belong to something. Another way of saying, we are in this season together. His granddaughter nodded slowly, absorbing his words. The fire shifted, sending a small spray of sparks upward, which faded into darkness as quickly as they appeared. In another corner of the world, in a bustling city in India, where the day existed more as an online event than a street-level ritual, a young woman scrolled through her phone and paused on an article about the origins of Black Friday. She read about Philadelphia, about the fog, about the traffic, about the weary officers and crowded streets. She imagined it all as if watching a scene through soft glass lantern light. The press of bodies, the sound of footsteps growing louder with each passing hour. She smiled, intrigued, and whispered to herself, it began with people, not with sales, with people. There is something important in that realization. Before Black Friday was a season of discounts and digital banners. It was simply a day when too many people occupied too little space. A day when the human desire to gather collided with the physical limits of streets and schedules. A day when a city discovered the weight of its own abundance and gave that weight a name. Even now, as the holiday season stretches across websites and global shipping routes, as countdown clocks glow in the corners of screens, the heart of the tradition remains deeply human. Consider the workers who stock shelves through the night, moving quietly under bright warehouse lights while the rest of the world sleeps. Consider the delivery drivers guiding their vehicles through rain and snow, their headlights cutting soft arcs through the dark as they bring small packages to doorsteps adorned with wreaths. Consider the parents choosing a single gift they can afford, hoping it will bring joy to someone they love. None of these moments are visible in the polished advertisements, yet they are the veins through which the tradition truly flows. And if we return, in our minds, to Philadelphia for a moment back through the years, through the screens, through the glowing shopping malls and digital carts, we find those first officers once again, standing in the cold, their breath hanging in the air. We find shopkeepers rubbing their tired hands. We find families drifting through fog, children holding their parents' coats, their eyes shining with the excitement of a city alive. Black Friday, in its first form, was heavy, yes, but it was also full of life. It revealed how deeply people longed to step into the season together, even when no one had planned the right number of officers, buses, or open streets. It revealed the unpredictability and wonder of human behavior, the way traditions can grow not from careful design, but from 1,000 small decisions made in the same moment. And as the world transformed around it through highways, through malls, through screens, the day carried that core truth with it. We are always trying to find ways to cross from one chapter of the year into another, and we rarely do it alone. Now, on modern Black Fridays, whether quiet or crowded, visible or invisible, that crossing continues. Some mark it by rising before sunrise and driving beneath a pale, moon-paled sky. Others mark it by sitting in bed with a soft blanket and a cool screen. Some ignore it entirely, choosing instead to walk in a park, to read, to rest. Yet all of these choices exist within the same shared frame, the same turning of the year, the same inherited story that began once upon a cold November morning in a single American city. The storm has changed shape, but not its sky. The ritual has changed sound, but not its heart. And somewhere, under all the noise and light, the world still carries that first quiet question, drifting like fog between street lamps. What do we truly seek on a day like this, things or connection? Perhaps, in the end, it has always been both. As Black Friday continued its steady expansion through cultures and calendars, the world began to reshape the meaning of the day yet again. For some, it remained a celebration of bargains and anticipation. For others, it became a symbol of excess. But for many, perhaps quietly, invisibly, it grew into something gentler, a moment to reflect on how people gather, how traditions evolve, and how the passage of time carves memory into ritual. In many places, the day softened into a kind of winter prologue, streets filled not only with shoppers, but with music-soft carols drifting from open doors, instrumental melodies floating from speakers above busy squares. The aroma of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts mingled with the cold air as markets opened their doors for the season. Even those who did not shop felt the shift. They felt it in the pinprick of cold at their fingertips, in the warm lights strung across trees and lampposts, in the sudden brightness of window displays reflecting hopes for the holidays ahead. In a small town in Vermont, snow fell gently one Black Friday morning, blanketing the sidewalks in soft layers of white. A young boy named Jonah pressed his forehead against the frosted window of the family bookstore where his mother worked. Outside, people walked with slow, careful steps, their boots leaving crisp impressions in the untouched snow. His mother, arranging a display of winter-themed novels, glanced over her shoulder. "Do you want to help today?" she asked with a warm smile. Jonah nodded eagerly. He loved this day, though he didn't quite know why. Something about the gentle bustle, the glow of the lamps inside the store, the sound of soft greetings as customers shook snow from their coats, filled him with the sense that something beautiful was beginning. It was not about sales or presents. It was something deeper, something woven into the fabric of the season. "That's the thing about today," his mother murmured as she watched him greet a customer with shy delight. "Everyone thinks it's about buying, but truly, it's about arriving, about stepping into winter with open hands." Far away, in a noisier city in Brazil, where the temperature was warm and humid instead of cold, a man named Raphael sat with his father on the balcony of their apartment. They overlooked a bustling street filled with vendors calling out their prices. Black Friday had taken root here too, but with a different texture, sunlight glinting off bright signs, markets overflowing with color instead of snow. Raphael's father pointed at a crowd forming near a shop entrance. "See that?" he said with a soft chuckle. "That's become our version of it. Not like the photos you showed me from America, with fog and coats and breath in the air. But the feeling, maybe it's the same." Raphael nodded. "People coming together," he said quietly, "even if it's hot instead of cold." His father leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as the warm breeze brushed his face. "Traditions travel," he whispered, "but they always become part of the place where they land." In Germany, the day inspired quiet debate. Some people embraced the new custom wholeheartedly, enjoying the excitement of early winter shopping. Others resisted, preferring the quieter rhythm of Advent markets lit by candles and mulled wine. But even there, Black Friday seeped softly into the cultural calendar, woven between older traditions like threads of a new color added to an ancient tapestry. Across oceans, in Japan, the day took on a uniquely serene form. Shops offered modest discounts accompanied by gentle music and simple displays. People browsed calmly, appreciating the early touch of winter light falling through tall windows. In some neighborhoods, the quiet hum of shoppers was indistinguishable from the everyday soundscape, yet still. A subtle shift signaled the approach of the holiday season. Black Friday had become not a single story, but 1,000 small stories whispered across continents. And still, the origins remained quiet, fog-wrapped, waiting behind every retelling. In one university lecture hall in Istanbul, a professor of cultural anthropology stood before a group of students. Behind her, on a soft-lit projector screen, was a sepia-toned photograph of 1950s Philadelphia, a street crowded with early shoppers, officers standing at intersections, trolleys paused in a fog that curled like smoke around their wheels. "This," she said gently, her voice measured and warm, "is where the name began. Not in celebration, not in commerce, but in strain, in the challenge of human gathering. Yet look how the meaning evolved, how each culture shaped the day into something that reflected its own needs, its own story." A student raised her hand. "So is Black Friday good or bad?" she asked softly. The professor paused, considering the question. She clasped her hands in front of her, and the room grew still. "It's neither," she answered, "or perhaps it is both. Like any tradition born from human behavior, it contains multitudes. It reveals our desires to gather, to prepare, to hope, to share. Sometimes these desires become tangled. Sometimes they become beautiful. But always they show us who we are in the turning of the year. The students scribbled notes, their pens whispering softly against paper. Outside, the late autumn sky stretched pale and delicate over the rooftops, as if listening. Everywhere across cities, villages, homes, and hearts the world carried the legacy of a day born from both heaviness and wonder. And now, as we approach the final arc of this long, drifting tale, we return once more to Philadelphia, to the quiet cradle where the storm first formed, to the soft echo of footsteps dissolving into fog, to the earliest glimmers of a name that would travel farther than anyone could have dreamed. For every journey, no matter how wide its sweep, eventually circles back to its beginning. And so, as the long arc of history bends gently toward the present moment, we drift back slowly, softly, softly to where this story first breathed. To Philadelphia, wrapped in its November fog, holding the quiet seed of a tradition it did not yet understand. The world has changed countless times since that morning. Streets have widened, screens have multiplied, voices now travel across oceans in an instant. Yet something of that first day lingers still, like a faint perfume absorbed into the wood of an old room. Return with me now. The year is modern, the city alive with new light. Glass towers reflect the pale shimmer of winter sun. The broad avenues bustle with people carrying coffees, phones, and headphones instead of the woolen parcels and folded newspapers of old. Cars glide through intersections where trolleys once rattled. Yet even in the sleek hum of traffic, you can sense the ghost of the old patterned footsteps layered over footsteps, breath layered over breath. It is Black Friday once more. In the early morning quiet, before the crowds appear, a soft fog moves between the buildings the way it did long ago. It curls along sidewalks and pools near alleys, carrying a faint chill that feels almost familiar, as if the city itself remembers those past Novembers. The street lamps glow in gentle halos, their light caught in droplets hanging like pearls from iron rails and window ledges. And into this quiet, a man appears older now, his shoulders curved with the soft weight of years. His name is Robert, a retired officer who once walked these very blocks in a younger body, a younger world. He carries no ledger today, only memory, only breath. He pauses at the corner where he once directed crowds, the very same corner where long ago an officer had first written the fateful words Black Friday conditions. The building beside him has changed. The lamppost is newer, but the stone beneath his feet is the same stone, worn smooth by a century of footsteps. Robert closes his eyes, and suddenly he hears it again, not in sound, but in memory. The hum of people pushing through the fog. The echo of trolleys clanging like bells in distant halls. The low murmur of officers calling to one another across busy intersections. The strange, electric feeling that came from standing in the center of a city awake far too early. When he opens his eyes again, the morning has brightened. The fog thins, rising in pale, ghost-like tendrils and dissolving into the growing light. A group of teenagers laughs as they pass by. A cyclist rings his bell. A bus pulls up to the curb, its doors opening with a soft sigh. Black Friday has changed, but the ground remembers. A few blocks away, in a cafe built on the bones of an old bakery, a young woman sits by the window, sipping a warm drink as she writes in a leather notebook. Her name is Nadia, a graduate student studying cultural history. She has been researching the origins of Black Friday for months. In front of her lies a photocopy of a decades-old newspaper clipping, a worn article, describing the chaos of the day and quoting the police who had once given it its name. She reads it again, tracing the faded headline with her thumb. The words feel heavy with time, softened by stories that have been told and retold. She glances out the window, watching the street awaken, and imagines how it must have looked all those years ago. The fog, the footsteps, the jammed streets, the weariness and wonder of it all. She writes a line in her notebook. Asterisk traditions often begin where exhaustion meets necessity. Asterisk, she pauses, then adds, asterisk, and where people are unknowingly building the rituals of the future. Asterisk, outside, the day grows brighter still. Families exit hotels, bundled in scarves, speaking in many languages. Some are tourists, drawn by curiosity, wishing to experience an American tradition. Others are locals, simply beginning the rhythm of their day. Down the street, a few shops already have customers inside, though the opening rush is gentler now than it once was. Many have chosen to stay home, to shop from couches and kitchen tables, their screens filled with digital storefronts. But even in this new form, something of the old spirit remains. There is anticipation in the air, soft, warm, almost tender. People are stepping into winter, into the season of light and gathering, and the city, aware of its legacy, seems to breathe in a little deeper, as if remembering every November that has passed through its veins. Near Independence Hall, a small group of schoolchildren gathers for a field trip. Their teacher, a woman with silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, smiles as she tells them the story of Black Friday's origins. She speaks not of crowds and discounts, but of history, of how cities grow, of how language evolves, of how traditions sometimes begin in the humblest of ways. History is not always made by grand events, she says softly. Sometimes it is born from a single morning, a single word, a single sigh written in a ledger so that someone, somewhere, might remember. One child raises his hand, his voice bright and curious. Do people still call it that because of the traffic? The teacher laughs gently. Not anymore. Names change meaning as we use them. But inside every tradition, there is a story waiting patiently to be told. The children nod, their eyes wide, sensing the magic of a world where names do not simply exist but carry whole histories within them. As the day unfolds, Philadelphia continues to move, its pulse steady and warm. Modern Black Friday is calmer now, softened by technology, widened by culture, transformed by time. Yet every so often, a quiet echo drifts through the streets, like the faint ringing of an old trolley bell. A reminder, a whisper, a lantern glowing in the fog of memory. This is where it began. In the heart of a city that woke too early. In the weary ink of a police ledger. In the stepping of countless feet across cold stone. In the fog that hid and revealed a new ritual waiting to be born. And the world, always listening, always adapting, carried it forward. The day continues its quiet procession, and Philadelphia, cradle of the name, keeper of the origin, moves with a gentleness that seems almost aware of its own story. As the morning stretches into afternoon, winter sunlight washes over the city in a pale, steady glow, softening sharp edges, smoothing the surfaces of windows and stone. The wind carries the faint scent of roasted nuts from a corner vendor, echoing scents that drifted through these same streets generations ago. Nadia, still seated by the cafe window, closes her notebook and steps out into the crisp air. Her breath forms a small cloud before dissolving. She tucks her scarf closer around her throat and begins to walk. She heads toward the old police station, the very building where the first Black Friday report was written. The station has long since been converted into offices, but the facade remains, preserved in stone and memory. As she approaches, She imagines what it once felt like. The flurry of officers rushing in and out, their boots wet from the morning fog, their voices hurried and layered. She imagines the young patrolman unknown, unnoticed bending over his ledger, unaware of the small immortality drying in the ink beneath his hand. Nadia pauses in front of the building and places her palm gently against the cold stone. History is not loud, she thinks. Not always. Sometimes it whispers. Across the street, Robert the retired officer continues his slow walk. He notices the young woman standing there, head bowed slightly, as though listening to something beneath the city's breath. He approaches with the measured steps of someone who no longer hurries, whose sense of time has softened like river stones smoothed by years. Studying the old place, he asks kindly. Nadia turns and offers a warm smile. Yes, I'm researching the origins of Black Friday. He chuckles softly. A story tangled in fog and footsteps. She raises her eyebrows with curiosity. You remember it? I remember the stories, he says, leaning on the railing beside her. I came long after that first chaotic day, but the older officers spoke of it often. They said the city felt heavier that morning, like a storm gathering without clouds. Nadia listens closely, her breath shallow with fascination. I always wondered, Robert continues, if they understood what they'd begun. That a name, said half in jest, half in weariness, could travel so far. She studies his face, the lines etched from years of service, the quiet wisdom in his eyes. Why do you think it lasted? She asks. He considers this for a long time, watching the pedestrians pass beneath the winter sun. Because it was honest, he finally says. It described a feeling we all recognized, even if we didn't admit it out loud. And because traditions, they often grow from the things that press on us, from the moments that gather us together, even when they challenge us. They stand in silence for a moment, letting the layered echoes of history settle around them like slow-falling snow. Nearby, a young couple walks past, hand in hand, wrapped in matching scarves. The woman carries a small bag filled with candles. The man holds a box tied with twine, their steps easy and unhurried. They are not rushing for deals, they are wandering, savoring the calm. Black Friday has become, for them, a day of soft beginnings rather than frantic pursuit. In a small park just a block away, a group of musicians plays gentle winter melodies. Their violin bows move with slow precision, their notes curling through the cold air like ribbons of warm silk. Children toss breadcrumbs to sparrows pecking near the benches. A man reads a newspaper with the headline, Black Friday, a tradition in transition. The city seems to hum with quiet reflection. It is here in this convergence of old and new that a remarkable truth begins to emerge. Black Friday has never been just one thing. It was born in strain, shaped by crowds, softened by years, expanded by technology, transformed by culture, reimagined by countless lives, weaving it into their own stories. In the distance, church bells begin to ring. Their sound drifts gently across rooftops and through the bare branches of trees, falling like warm snow over the sidewalks below. Nadia closes her notebook, absorbing the music. Robert tips his head to listen, a wistful smile touching his lips. Funny, he says quietly. Even with everything that's changed, this day still feels familiar. She nods. Traditions survive because they carry memory. Not the details, but the feeling. Together, they walk down the street to generations, threaded suddenly into the same tapestry of history. As the bells fade, the city exhales once more along. Soft breath that seems to connect every story, every November, every footstep from past to present. Philadelphia glows gently under the winter sky, and for a moment, everything feels suspended. Still, like the pause between heartbeats. A reminder that even in a world remade by screens and speed, the simplest threads endure. Fog, footsteps, and the quiet power of a name. As the afternoon light leans slowly toward evening, the city begins its soft descent into twilight. Philadelphia's skyline shimmers faintly beneath a sky brushed with gentle strokes of gold and lavender. The air cools, carrying with it the tender scent of distant fireplaces and warm pastries drifting from bakeries that have just lit their early evening lamps. The city hums not loudly, but with a low, comforting murmur, like a lullaby sung beneath breath. Nadia and Robert continue walking through the familiar streets, moving at a pace unhurried and reflective. Around them, the world progresses in quiet arcs. A dog barking softly from a stoop, the muted ring of a bicycle bell, a mother pulling her child's mitten up over tiny fingers, whispering something that makes the child smile. Life unfolds with gentleness, as if the city is settling into the soft pocket of the day, where memory and present blend. They arrive at a narrow alley where the old cobblestones remain intact stones that, in another era, had felt the heavy footfall of crowds in the cold November fog. The stones gleam now under the fading sun, wet from a light afternoon drizzle, their uneven surfaces reflecting small patches of yellow and rose. Nadia kneels, brushing her fingertips over one of the stones. How many footsteps, she murmurs, have passed through here, unaware they were shaping history. Robert chuckles lightly. Most history is made without knowing it, he says. That's what makes it so human. Across the street, an antique shop glows warmly. Its window displays old postcards, faded photographs, small brass clocks, and handwritten journals whose ink has softened with age. Drawn by the gentle amber light, they step inside. A bell above the door tinkles softly, its sound delicate as thin glass. The shop smells of old paper, cedar shelves, and something faintly floral perhaps, a perfume bottle left uncorked decades ago. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper, an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pinned neatly in a bun, greets them with a serene smile. Looking for anything special? She asks. Nadia shakes her head. Just browsing. We were talking about the origins of Black Friday. The shopkeeper's eyes warm. Ah, she whispers. I remember my father speaking of it, long before it became what it is today. He told me the city felt like a pot boiling over, full of energy, full of life. She pauses, gazing at a photograph on the far-wallen, old black and white image of Market Street, thick with people bundled in heavy coats. They used to call it chaotic, she continues softly, but he always said it felt like the beginning of something bright, like standing at the doorway of winter and knowing warmth was on its way. Nadia feels the words settle into her like warm tea. Robert looks at the photograph, his voice nearly a whisper. Funny, I've walked that street 1,000 times, but hearing it described that way, it feels different. Outside, the sky shifts again. Evening deepens. The street lamps blink on one, then another, spreading circles of soft gold onto the damp pavement. People move through these pools of light like silhouettes in a dream, their shadows stretching and folding in gentle motions. The shopkeeper wraps a small purchase for another customer and bids them good night. As Nadia browses the shelves, her eyes fall upon a thin, old notebook with a cracked leather cover. She opens it carefully. Inside are fragments of daily notes from a merchant who once ran a tiny shop in Philadelphia during the 1950s. One entry catches her breath. Asterisk, the day after Thanksgiving. Streets overflowing. So many faces tired, joyful, restless. A policeman called it Black Friday. The name fits. But there's a strange beauty in it too. A feeling that winter has begun. Nadia closes the notebook gently, her heart full. When she steps outside again, the evening air greets her with a chill that feels almost nostalgic. Robert stands beside her, hands in his coat pockets, as the first true shadows of night settle between the buildings. Funny how a place holds memory, Nadia says. Robert nods. Even when people don't, they begin walking again, their footsteps soft against the glistening pavement. The quiet of evening wraps around them like a shawl. Store windows glow with warm displays candles, wreaths, cozy sweaters each, one a small beacon against the growing dusk. Down the street, a street musician sits beneath a lamppost, playing a slow, tender melody on a violin. The sound drifts upward like a ribbon of light, its notes lingering in the air, catching on the brick walls before dissolving. Passers-by pause to listen, their expressions softening as though the music has brushed something delicate inside them. Nadia and Robert stop too. For a moment, they say nothing. The music fills the space between them, between the city and its memories, between the long-ago fog and the modern glow. It's strange, Nadia whispers. Black Friday began with overwhelm. But now, standing here, the story feels so peaceful. It's because you're seeing it from the outside, Robert replies gently. From a distance of years, time softens things, like frost melting from a window pane. A soft snow begins to fall, flakes drifting through the lamplight, swirling in slow, graceful circles. The city grows quieter still, as though listening to its own past. And for the briefest moment, everything aligns. The fog of yesterday, the glow of today, the footsteps that once shook the streets, the silence that now holds them gently. Philadelphia stands, timeless and breathing, holding the birth of a tradition that has traveled far beyond its borders, a tradition carried by families, by cultures, by millions of hands and hearts, a tradition that began with a name whispered in exhaustion, and has become, somehow, a moment of connection across the world. Night, at last, settles fully over Philadelphia. The sky becomes a deep, velvety blue, stitched with the faintest outlines of clouds gliding slowly across its face. The city's windows shine like scattered constellations, each one a private story lit from within. Street lamps drip soft halos of light onto the damp ground, and the snowflakes, caught in those halos, appear briefly as glimmering sparks before melting into the darkness. Nadia and Robert find themselves drawn toward the river, following streets that slope gently downward. The Delaware lies ahead like a strip of dark glass, its surface rippling with the reflections of distant lights. Long ago, ships had crossed this water carrying goods and people into a city that was still learning what it would become. Today, the river remains, a patient witness to every November that has passed. They reach the promenade and pause at the railing, leaning slightly over the edge as they look out at the water. The air is colder here, sharpened by the open space. Their breaths rise in faint streams, twisting briefly upward before vanishing. Somewhere behind them, the city murmurs a distant blend of car engines. Soft laughter, a door closing, a bell chiming from a streetcar line that now mostly carries echoes. It's quiet, Nadia says softly. Quieter than it used to be, Robert replies. But the quiet has its own kind of truth. They stand side by side, letting the sound of the water fill the spaces between them. The river laps gently against the pilings below, a steady, soothing rhythm like the slow heartbeat of the city itself. Lights from the opposite shore shimmer in elongated strokes, bending and trembling each time the surface stirs. After a while, Nadia speaks again. "Do you ever think," she asks, "about what Black Friday says about us, not just as a city, but as people?" Robert smiles faintly, lines deepening around his eyes. "All the time," he answers. "For years, I watched the crowds, some excited, some exhausted, some just trying to get through the day. And I realized something." He turns to her, his voice low and steady. "It isn't just about buying things. It's about how we move together. How we chase warmth when the year grows cold. How we look for moments that make us feel less alone in the dark half of the year." Nadia listens, the wind brushing loose strands of hair across her face. She tucks them back gently. "I've been reading so many articles," she says, "arguing about whether Black Friday is harmful or harmless, materialistic or practical. But standing here, thinking of where it came from, it feels more like a mirror, a reflection of whatever we bring to it." Robert nods. "Exactly. For some, it's noise. For others, it's tradition. For a few, it's simply work-long shifts on their feet, smiles worn like armor. And for many, it's a moment shared with family or friends, even if they don't name it that way." A slow-moving barge drifts along the river, its lights glowing softly. The sound of its engine is low and distant, like a deep hum. They watch it for a while, their eyes following its slow progress until it becomes nothing more than a fading streak of brightness on the water. In the end, Nadia says quietly, "It started because people couldn't help but gather." "Yes," Robert replies, "the city overflowed. And when we overflow, we create stories whether we mean to or not." Behind them, near the entrance to the promenade, a small group of friends laughs as they pose for a photograph, bundling close against the cold. One of them mentions Black Friday sales. Another mentions the history teacher who told them it began here, in their own city. The conversation drifts toward them on the windlight, ordinary, unburdened. Nadia smiles at the sound. "There it is," she whispers, "the story still alive. Not in the details, but in the sense of being part of something." Robert leans on the railing, his eyes reflecting the river's scattered light. "You know," he says, "when I was young on the force, I used to complain about these days. Too much work, too many people. But now, I look back, and what I remember most is not the frustration. It's the feeling of standing at the center of something larger than myself. A city fully awake. A calm silence follows. Snow continues to fall, thin and unhurried. It gathers in small, delicate layers along the railing, on the tops of benches, on the brims of hats. The river accepts it without protest, each flake dissolving as it touches the surface, as if folding quietly into the ongoing story. "We are strange creatures," Nadia says at last. "We turn crowds into customs, inconvenience into tradition, strain into celebration." "We do," Robert agrees. "And sometimes, we even make meaning out of traffic jams." They both laugh softly, their voices mingling with the sound of the water. Above them, the sky deepens further, shedding its lavender hues and settling into a dark, steady blue. A single star appears, then another, then a faint scatter of distant lights. The city's glow will always drown out most of the heavens, but tonight, a few stars manage to pierce through, hanging quietly above the place where it all began. Nadia inhales deeply, filling her lungs with the cold air, as if trying to take in not just the present moment, but all the Black Fridays that came before those dense mornings, those weary officers, those merchants counting receipts by candlelight, those early families pressing through fog to watch parades, to find gifts, to feel that they were stepping into something new. She exhales slowly. "Maybe someday," she says, "this will change again." Maybe people will look back and think our version of Black Friday was quaint or strange or excessive. Maybe they'll have another name for the day after Thanksgiving. Maybe they'll move through it in ways we cannot imagine. Almost certainly, Robert replies. That is what time does. It keeps moving. It keeps rewriting. And yet, she continues, this river will still be here. These stones, this sky, the place where a single phrase found its wings. He nods. History, he says softly, is just memory seen from far enough away that the sharp edges blur into something we can hold. The two of them stand in silence for a moment longer, letting the night deepen around them like a gentle cloak. The world beyond Philadelphia continues its restless spin screens flickering, packages traveling, crowds gathering both in person and online. Yet here, by the river where the city once first overflowed, everything feels simple, soft, almost still. A city remembering, a tradition breathing, a story lingering quietly between water and sky. The night deepens further, folding softly around Philadelphia like a warm, dark blanket. Along the riverside path, the snow grows steadier flakes, drifting in slow spirals. Gathering in the grooves of cobblestones and along the edges of benches where no one sits. The world feels suspended, held gently between breath and silence. Nadia and Robert turn back toward the heart of the city. They walk slowly, neither wanting to rush this quiet pilgrimage. With each step, the past seems to walk beside them, threading itself through the present like the faint echo of a melody heard long ago. As they pass the old streets once crowded with fog-draped shoppers, the snow muffles their footsteps. Street lamps glow brighter against the darkening sky, shedding circles of warm, honey-colored light that make the falling snow shimmer like powdered gold. Above them, the faint ringing of a bell perhaps from a passing streetcar or a distant church drifts across the night, comforting in its familiarity. When they reach Market Street, the wide avenue is calmer than it once would have been on a Black Friday. Decades ago, this road would have been choked with cars, horns blaring impatiently, drivers leaning out of windows with hopeful or exasperated looks. Today, the traffic flows smoothly. Technology has thinned the crowds, softened the chaos. Yet the energy of the day still lingers, woven into the shop displays. The distant chatter of passers-by, the seasonal wreaths hanging in soft currents of cold air. Near the corner where an officer once wrote the words that would travel the world, a small plaque now stands. Most who pass it hardly notice its metal face blends into the brick wall behind it. But Nadia sees it immediately. She steps closer, brushing snow from its surface. The inscription reads, "Asterisk on this street, in the mid-20th century, officers of the Philadelphia Police Department first used the term Black Friday to describe the extraordinary crowds and traffic that followed Thanksgiving. The name became a part of the city's legacy and the world's." Asterisk Nadia smiles softly, touched by the simplicity. It is not elaborate. It does not tell the whole story, but it preserves the heartbeat of the day, the human moment from which everything else grew. Robert stands beside her, his gaze warm with memory. "Funny thing," he says. "That first officer never imagined his words would stretch so far beyond this block." "That's how stories work," Nadia replies gently. "They grow legs, they travel, they find new homes, they continue walking, passing a bakery just as the owner flips the sign to asterisk, closed asterisk. The warmth from the interior spills briefly onto the sidewalk before the door shuts, leaving a faint scent of cinnamon and fresh bread lingering in the air. The glow inside flickers through the window like a small hearth, a reminder of the human labor that has always been woven into this day past and present. They enter the quieter part of Old City, where buildings stand with a kind of dignified stillness. Here, the snow gathers more thickly, and the streets narrow, the world dimming into soft shadows. Nadia stops again, turning toward Robert with a contemplative expression. "Do you ever think about how many people," she says, "step into Black Friday without realizing they're participating in a story almost a century old?" "All the time," he answers. "But stories don't disappear just because we forget their beginnings. They live in what we do, not what we know." She nods, letting the words settle. In a nearby townhouse, a family lounges in their living room. A grandmother knits quietly in an armchair, the needles clicking like distant raindrops. A child curls on the carpet, surrounded by the warmth of blankets and the soft glow of fairy lights. The parents talk in low voices about gifts, travel plans, and the year that has nearly passed. They don't speak of Black Friday's origins, but they live within its long-shadowed, softened, transformed version without even knowing. Across town, in a student apartment, two friends sit cross-legged on the floor, sipping steaming mugs of tea as they browse online deals. One reads aloud from their screen, laughing at how the sales now last for weeks rather than hours. The other wonders aloud if the real meaning of the day is simply taking a moment to transition to mark the boundary between autumn and winter, between comfort and anticipation. Meanwhile, in a quiet nursing home, a former shopkeeper named Mr. Levine now in his 80s sits by a window watching the snow fall. Black Friday used to be the busiest day of his year. He remembers the foggy mornings, the heavy coats, the hum of conversation outside his shop door. He remembers wrapping gifts with aching hands, smiling at customers whose faces blurred into a warm, timeless mosaic. He closes his eyes, hearing again the distant laughter, the soft scrape of shoes on his wooden floor, the sound of his wife counting the till at the end of the night. "It was exhausting," he whispers, "but it was good." All across the city, echoes rise. Echoes of footsteps, of laughter, of doors opening and closing, of lives weaving themselves into the fabric of a tradition far older than they realize. Black Friday is no longer just a day. It is a tapestry stitched together by thousands of hands, across years and continents, across cultures and expectations. As Nadia and Robert approach the end of their walk, the snowfall thickens. The flakes land on their coats, on their hair, on the small plaque they pass one last time. The city glows beneath its delicate dusting, each rooftop softened, each shadow deepened. Philadelphia looks ancient and young all at once, like a memory, freshly breathed. They stop where their paths will part. Robert turns to her with a gentle smile. "You're doing good work," he says softly, "telling stories that deserve to be told." Nadia feels the warmth of the words settle in her chest. "Thank you for walking with me," he nods. "Every generation needs someone who listens." They exchange a final, quiet farewell. Robert heads toward the neighborhood where he built his life. Nadia turns toward her apartment, her notebook tucked under her arm, her breath rising in tiny clouds that dissolve into the falling snow. As she walks, she whispers to herself, "There is beauty in the way traditions are born, and the way they change." The city agrees, exhaling softly as the wind carries her words away. The snow continues its soft descent upon Philadelphia, blurring the boundaries between roofs and sky, between present and memory. Each flake drifts slowly, as if reluctant to fall, hovering a moment in the lamplight before settling gently onto windowsills, railings, and the quiet shoulders of those who walk beneath. Evening deepens into night once more, but not the sharp, cold night of years past. This night is calm, muted, touched by warmth that feels almost ancient. As Nadia approaches her apartment building, she pauses on the sidewalk and looks back toward the city. The distant lights shimmer through a curtain of snow, turning the skyline into a watercolor of golds and silvers floating in the dark. Somewhere out there, beyond the layers of streets and windows, lie the echoes of those first crowded mornings, the fog, the footsteps, the weary officers writing reports that would outlive them. She places a hand over her notebook, feeling the weight of the pages. They no longer feel empty. They carry the voices of the people she has met, the stories she has gathered, the quiet truths she has uncovered. Inside her building, the warmth embraces her like an old friend. She climbs the stairs slowly, savoring the soft creak of the wood beneath her feet. On the landing, she passes a neighbor carrying a bag of groceries. "Cold night," the neighbor says with a smile. "Cold," Nadia answers, "but beautiful." She enters her apartment, turning on only a single lamp. Its golden glow spills into the dimness, casting long, gentle shadows across the walls. She makes a cup of tea, the steam rising in soft curls, and settles by her window. From here, she can see the snow gathering along the ledges, the street below painted in warm circles of lamplight, the distant silhouettes of people hurrying home for the night. She opens her notebook and begins to write not facts, not citations, but something quieter, something closer to memory than to research. Asterisk Black Friday began as a moment of strain. Asterisk, she writes. Asterisk, but became a moment of connection. A ritual shaped, not by design, but by the way people gather when seasons turn. Its meaning changed because we changed. And yet, beneath all the layers of commerce and noise, there remains a story of people trying to find light in the dark. Asterisk, she pauses, letting the pen rest against the page. The snow outside thickens, swirling like soft breath around the street lamps. Across the city, Robert has returned home. He hangs his coat by the door, sits in his favorite chair, and lifts his feet to rest on a worn ottoman. His small living room is lit by a single lamp and the faint glow from a nearby fish tank. He leans back, closing his eyes, and he remembers. Not every detail memory does not work that way, but the feeling of those early Black Fridays, the weight of responsibility, the warmth of human energy, the sound of distant music drifting through fog, the sense of standing in the middle of something immense and unpredictable. The city had been younger then, but it had already carried a certain wisdom and understanding that people, when gathered in great numbers, create something larger than themselves. He smiles softly, breathing in the calm. Not far from him, in another neighborhood, the elderly shopkeeper from earlier is closing her own small store. She turns the key in the lock, listening to the satisfying click. Snow has collected on the awning above her door, and she brushes it lightly before walking toward the bus stop. Each step leaves a delicate imprint in the fresh snow. She thinks of her father, his stories of those early days, his laughter as he described the pandemonium of that first Black Friday, the lines stretching out the door, the way the city felt alive, in a way both overwhelming and beautiful. People, he used to say, are always trying to find something to hold on to when the year grows dark. As she waits for the bus, she lifts her face to the sky and feels snowflakes melt against her cheeks. Across town, the violinist continues to play beneath a lamppost. Though the night grows colder, his music drifts into the darkness, catching on the snow like droplets of warm light. A passerby pauses to listen, then another. For a moment, the sidewalk becomes a tiny island of shared quiet, and far beyond Philadelphia, thousands of miles away, in cities that have never known its fog or its brick-lined streets, people are ending their own versions of this day. In São Paulo, in Seoul, in London, in Nairobi, in Melbourne. some with bags of gifts by their doors, some with empty carts and full hearts, some with nothing but the desire to rest after a long week, watching the lights flicker through their windows. Whether they name the day or not, whether they embrace it or ignore it, they are part of a living thread that reaches back to a single moment in the 1950s, moment drawn in fog and exhaustion, captured in ink, softened by time. Traditions are strange things. They begin without permission, without fanfare. They start in the breathing of ordinary people. They grow in the spaces between stories. They endure because they speak to something deep and quiet within us. And now, as the world settles into the later hours of night, the tradition of Black Friday settles too. The snow outside Nadia's window thickens further. The violinist's song fades. The lights from the distant skyscrapers flicker against the falling white, like stars being born behind clouds. Philadelphia rests, the story rests, and the world leans gently toward the soft final chapter of this tale. The night grows deeper still, settling into a hushed and velvety calm. Snow continues to drift through the quiet air, as though time itself has slowed to let the world breathe more gently. In homes and streets and silent corners across Philadelphia and across the many cities that have since inherited its tradition, people begin to rest. The soft glow of lamps dims, conversations taper into murmurs, screens fade into darkness, and the world, for a brief moment, enters a state of shared stillness. Nadia sits by her window, her notebook now closed, resting on her lap. She watches the snow gather against the glass, listens to the faint hum of the radiator, feels the warmth of her teacup fading against her palms. A peaceful exhaustion settles over her, the kind that comes after a long day of walking through memory, of holding stories with care. She gazes out at the city, at the snow making halos around streetlights, at the shapes of buildings softened into silhouettes. The city seems to drift in and out of dream state, caught between the waking world and something quieter, something older. This is the hour, she realizes, when the past feels closest, when the ghosts of old footsteps walk gently alongside the living ones. She whispers into the quiet, "Thank you for the story, for how far it has traveled." Meanwhile, Robert sits in his armchair, a blanket draped over his knees. His eyes grow heavy. The memories of the day, both those he lived and those he inherited, float gently through his mind like slow-moving lanterns on a river. He thinks of the young woman at the cafe, the snow falling on the old police station, the echo of music under winter lamplight. His breath deepens. He drifts. Across town, the elderly shopkeeper steps into her home, brushing the snow from her coat. She sets down her keys, removes her gloves, and lights a single candle on her kitchen table. Its flame rises small and steady, filling the room with a warm amber glow. She sits and watches it dance, remembering her father's laughter, remembering the early crowds, remembering the joy and strain of seasons long gone. And in the quiet glow of that candle, she whispers, "It all began so simply. Asterisk, asterisk, indeed, it did. Asterisk, asterisk, because the story of Black Friday is not the story of commerce, though commerce grew from it. It is not the story of discounts, though discounts came to define it. It is the story of what happens when people gather, when streets fill beyond their capacity, when footsteps merge into a single pulse, when the world leans into winter not with fear, but with anticipation. It is the story of chaos turned ritual, of exhaustion turned tradition, of cities learning to carry the weight of their own abundance. It is the story of how language grows not by design, but by accident, by emotion, by necessity. And deeper still, It is the story of how we move through the darkening year. Across centuries and cultures, humans have sought brightness as the days grow short. Fires, lanterns, candles, lights along rooftops, music in cold air, warm meals shared under soft blankets. We gather not because we need things, but because we need one another. And every tradition, no matter how modern it may seem, carries the imprint of that ancient truth. Black Friday continues to evolve. It has taken forms its originators could never have imagined. Digital, global, quiet, bright. It has become a mirror that reflects each culture's own relationship with winter, with celebration, with community. But at its heart, the day remains what it has always been, a threshold between seasons, a moment of crossing, a step into the softest part of the year. Now, as the night deepens and the snow continues falling, the world seems to exhale. The streets soften under their pale blanket. The lights glow with a warmer hue. And somewhere, in the layers of memory that cling gently to Philadelphia's stones, the fog of that first morning rises once more briefly, beautifully before dissolving into the quiet. In that memory, we can still see the tired officer writing a note in his ledger. We can still hear the distant bells of a parade drifting through the mist. We can still feel the hum of thousands of footsteps pressing forward into the unknown. A name was born there. A tradition began there. A story that stretched across decades and continents took its first breath in that quiet, fog-laden dawn. And tonight, as the world rests, that story settles too, drifting down like snow upon the city that gave it life. Asterisk, asterisk, the streets grow still, the lights grow soft, the world turns toward winter. Asterisk, asterisk, and somewhere in the heart of Philadelphia, a lantern glows behind a window, its golden light trembling gently in the cold. A quiet reminder that history is not a distant thing. It lives in us, in the names we speak, in the footsteps we take, in the rituals we shape without knowing. And in the soft hush of a night like this, history feels very close. Asterisk, asterisk, thank you for listening tonight. Thank you for walking through this story. May your evening be warm, your rest be deep, and your dreams be filled with calm light. Asterisk, asterisk,